My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 43 years old, and I've spent the last 15 years building a quiet but steady career as a communications manager in Denver. I've always believed that if you work hard, stay kind, and never ask for too much, life will find a way to reward you. That belief shattered on the day my parents handed my brother $15 million and told me, he needs it more than you do. That moment still feels like a slow-motion car crash. Polite smiles, legal documents spread across the polished mahogany table, the hum of the air conditioner breaking the silence. I remember staring at the envelope in front of me, realizing there was nothing inside with my name on it. Nothing but air. My heart pounded so loudly that I almost didn't hear my mother say the words that would change everything. You're strong, Claire. You've always been the capable one. Daniel just needs a little help. A little help. $15 million worth of help. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just sat there, stunned, every memory of childhood favoritism and subtle neglect flashing through my mind like a slideshow I couldn't stop watching. It was as if every unspoken truth about our family had finally stepped into the light, uninvited but undeniable. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoy stories that make you feel, think, and question what family really means, make sure to subscribe and help this channel grow. Your support keeps these stories alive. When I was a little girl, I used to believe that fairness was natural, that love automatically meant equality. My brother and I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, surrounded by mountain air and the kind of childhood that looks picture perfect from the outside. But behind closed doors, my parents' love was lopsided in ways that only became clear over time. Daniel, my older brother, was the sun in their sky, radiant, charming, a little reckless, and I was the quiet moon that reflected light but never truly received it. As a child, I thought their attention toward him was normal. He needed more help with homework. He was sensitive, creative, a dreamer. When he failed his first business venture at 25, they called it an experiment. When he failed the next, they called it bad luck. And when he failed the third, they called it his big learning moment. Each failure brought another check, another lifeline, another soft cushion to land on. Meanwhile, I worked my way through college waiting tables, paid off my loans, and rented a tiny apartment that leaked every winter. My parents congratulated me in passing, proud in theory but detached in practice. You're doing great, sweetheart. You've always been strong. The same phrase, you've always been strong, became both compliment and curse. It was how they excused every moment of neglect. By the time I was in my 30s, Daniel had already burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars in investments. I had stopped asking about them because I already knew the ending. He'd try, he'd fail, and my parents would sweep in to clean up the mess. I wasn't jealous. At least I told myself I wasn't. I was tired. Tired of being the dependable one in a family that only noticed when someone fell apart. So, when my parents called one afternoon and asked me to attend a meeting with their lawyer in Denver, I assumed it was about estate planning. Nothing dramatic, just responsible adults organizing their legacy. I even felt proud, thinking they might finally treat Daniel and me equally. I wore my best navy blazer, the one that made me look like I belonged in rooms like that. But the moment I walked into Mr. Carlisle's office and saw the stack of folders, one thick with Daniel's name printed on it, the other thin and blank where mine should have been, I knew something was wrong. My parents smiled, a practiced, rehearsed smile, the kind that tried to soften a blow before it landed. Claire, my father began, you've done so well for yourself. We couldn't be prouder. I waited for the next sentence, hoping it would be something like, that's why we're giving you your share early, to invest, to grow. But instead, he continued, Daniel's been struggling with his restaurant. You know how hard the past few years have been for him. We want to give him $15 million to stabilize things. You understand, don't you? Do I understand? The words echoed in my head. My mother reached across the table, her diamond bracelet catching the light. You've never needed our help the way he has, darling. You're strong. You'll make your own way. I felt the heat rise behind my eyes, but I refused to let them see me break. I nodded, because that's what I'd always done. Agree, adapt, endure. Yet, deep down, something shifted. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the decision meant. It was proof that my worth in their eyes was measured not by who I was, but by how little I needed them. I wanted to say, strength doesn't mean I don't deserve care. I wanted to ask, when did being capable become a reason to be left out? But I didn't. I couldn't. My voice was a prisoner behind clenched teeth. As Mr. Carlyle began reading the legal terms of the transfer, the room grew smaller, tighter. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of traffic outside, but it all felt unreal. Daniel avoided my gaze, his guilt visible yet silent. My mother's hand rested on his shoulder like he was a fragile child, not a grown man receiving a fortune. My father's eyes flickered with satisfaction, the look of a man who believed he had done something noble. That's when I realized this wasn't an isolated moment. It was the culmination of years of quiet imbalance. Every forgotten birthday call, every "you'll be fine," every time I was left to figure things out alone, it all led here. This was the final chapter in a story I hadn't written but had been forced to live. Yet, even in that heartbreak, a strange calm settled in. Because deep down, I knew something they didn't. My grandmother, Margaret Ellis, had always promised that truth has a way of surfacing. And though I didn't know it then, she had left behind something that would rewrite everything my parents thought they controlled. That day, I walked out of the office with nothing in my hands but the faintest whisper of intuition telling me this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Now, before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, sitting across from your parents as they handed your sibling $15 million while giving you nothing but compliments, what would you do? A. Stay silent and walk away with dignity. B. Speak up and demand the fairness you deserve. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell me why. Your choice might reveal more about how you see family, fairness, and what strength really means. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, in a house that always looked perfect from the outside. A 2-story home with white shutters, a manicured lawn, and flower boxes that bloomed every spring. My parents, Michael and Elaine Donovan, were the kind of couple who believed in appearances, the right neighbors, the right vacations, the right schools. From the outside, we were the American ideal. But inside that perfect picture, love was distributed like a limited resource, lavishly to my brother Daniel, and sparingly to me. Daniel was 2 years older, with an easy smile and a natural charm that could melt anyone's heart. He was the kind of boy who turned mistakes into stories worth laughing about. When he crashed his first car, my father told the insurance agent it was a youthful accident. When he failed math, they hired a private tutor and said he was a creative mind, not a numbers person. When I aced my exams that same year, I remember my mother smiling and saying, "Of course you did, honey. You always do well." It was praise, technically, but hollow, like a pat on the head before being dismissed. I learned early that Daniel's failures brought attention, while my successes brought expectation. If he stumbled, the family stopped everything to pick him up. If I stumbled, I was told to stand taller. That dynamic became the rhythm of our lives. My parents didn't mean harm. I know that now. They simply believed that Daniel needed more because he was fragile, while I was strong enough. But as a child, that distinction carved invisible lines in my heart. I began to equate strength with loneliness. When we were teenagers, Daniel and I were close in the way siblings are when life hasn't yet taught them to measure love. He'd sneak me out to the old drive-in theater on summer nights, and we'd laugh until the car battery died. But even then I saw it. How my parents' faces lit up when he entered the room. How they softened their tone for him but grew brisk and managerial with me. "You'll understand when you're older," my mother would say, whenever I asked why Daniel always got the better end of things. After high school, the pattern deepened. Daniel went to an expensive private college in California that he barely attended, switching majors twice before dropping out. My parents called it self-discovery. I went to the University of Colorado on a scholarship, worked part-time, and still graduated summa cum laude. They attended his college orientation, but missed my graduation because, as my mother later explained, your father wasn't feeling well that weekend. I didn't argue. I'd already learned that disappointment was something you processed quietly in my family. When Daniel tried his hand at starting a small restaurant at 24, my parents were ecstatic. They poured money into it, loans, gifts, whatever he needed. When it failed, they called it a market downturn and encouraged him to try again. By his third failed venture, my father had remortgaged one of his investment properties to keep Daniel's dream alive. Meanwhile, I'd been living in a one-bedroom apartment in Denver, budgeting every paycheck, proud of the small life I'd built through my own effort. I remember once, after Daniel's second failure, my mother called me and said, "You should be proud of him, Claire. He's brave enough to take risks." I wanted to ask her why bravery always meant recklessness for him, but self-sufficiency for me. I wanted to say that I took risks every day too, emotional ones, financial ones, just by surviving without their help. But I didn't. Because in our family, silence kept the peace. When our grandmother, Margaret Ellis, still lived with us, she was the only one who noticed the imbalance. She'd pull me aside during holidays and whisper, "You know, darling, sometimes being the strong one means they forget you need love too." I'd nod, pretending I understood, but her words didn't truly settle in until years later. After she passed, that quiet voice of fairness vanished from our home, leaving the old pattern unchallenged. The years that followed blurred together in a mix of family dinners and unspoken hierarchies. Every time Daniel showed up, chaos followed. Broken relationships, new business ideas, debts he couldn't repay. And every time, my parents stepped in to rescue him with the same urgency they might reserve for saving someone drowning. I was expected to be the stable one, the calm center of their storm. "You're our rock, Claire," my father would say, as if it were an honor instead of a sentence. There was a Thanksgiving dinner I'll never forget. Daniel had just come back from another failed venture in Austin, and my parents spent the evening comforting him, telling him how proud they were that he tried. I brought a bottle of wine from a small local vineyard I'd helped promote through my work. No one opened it. Instead, they toasted Daniel for never giving up. I smiled politely, but something inside me cracked that night. I realized I could achieve everything I wanted: promotions, financial security, independence, and it would never weigh as much in their hearts as Daniel's potential. I don't think my parents hated me. In fact, I think they admired me in a way that made them complacent. They saw me as unbreakable, a finished product who didn't need nurturing. Their love for Daniel was active and anxious, hands constantly reaching to hold him up. Their love for me was quiet, passive, and detached. They didn't realize that silence, too, can wound. When my parents called to arrange that meeting with the lawyer, I remember Daniel's voice over the phone, casual and warm. "It's just about Mom and Dad sorting things out early," he said. "You know how they like to plan ahead." He didn't sound nervous. Why would he? He'd spent a lifetime being reassured that no matter how many mistakes he made, he would be saved. And me? I spent a lifetime being told I didn't need saving. That belief shaped every part of who I became. I worked harder, I stayed smaller, and I learned to carry my own weight quietly. It wasn't resentment that grew inside me. It was a sort of resigned acceptance. I told myself that independence was enough, that maybe being overlooked was the price of being capable. Looking back now, I see how deeply that belief ran. It dictated the jobs I chose, the relationships I avoided, even the way I spoke, always measured, never demanding. I became someone who didn't expect fairness, who mistook self-reliance for emotional strength. But under the surface, a small voice, my grandmother's voice, kept whispering, "You deserve more than being admired for surviving alone." I didn't know then that her words would resurface years later in the form of a letter, hidden inside a lawyer's folder, a letter that would prove she saw everything, the favoritism, the imbalance, the quiet injustice, and had acted to make it right. But before that day came, before any of the revelations that would shake the foundation of our family, I was still just Claire, the strong one, the dependable one, the daughter who didn't need help. I lived my life believing that being loved less was the cost of being capable. And that, I think, is the most dangerous lie any family can teach a child. The morning of the will reading was the kind of gray that sits heavy in your chest. Denver's sky hung low and dull, the air thick with the promise of rain. I remember staring out the window of the cab as the city blurred past, thinking about how strangely calm I felt. There was no reason to be nervous, I told myself. It was just a formality, my parents being their usual, overly organized selves. estate planning, responsible adulthood, nothing more. But a part of me, the part that had always been quietly waiting for the next disappointment, stayed on alert. When I walked into Mr. Carlyle's office, everything smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper. He was standing behind his desk, his gray suit crisp, his manner formal but kind. My parents were already there, seated side by side in front of him like a united front. My mother wore a pearl-colored blazer, her hair styled to perfection. My father's tie was the deep burgundy he always wore when he wanted to project authority. My brother Daniel was late, as usual. He breezed in 10 minutes later, coffee in hand, apologizing with that practiced smile that had excused him from consequences his entire life. "Let's begin," my father said, tapping his fingers against the table, as if the whole process were just another business meeting. Mr. Carlyle cleared his throat and began explaining that my parents had decided to restructure their estate while still alive. A living will, he called it, to ensure everyone understood their intentions. His voice was steady, professional, but there was something about the way he avoided looking at me that made my stomach twist. I watched as my parents exchanged a glance. They looked, rehearsed. My mother folded her hands, her voice soft and deliberate. "Claire, sweetheart, we wanted to do this now so there wouldn't be any confusion later on. We've decided to allocate a portion of our estate early to give Daniel the resources he needs to stabilize his restaurant." The word resources hit me like a slap. Mr. Carlyle turned a page, and there it was in black and white. $15 million. I blinked, sure I'd misread it. $15 million? I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. My father leaned forward, adopting that patient tone he used when he thought I was overreacting. "Claire, you have to understand. Daniel's business has struggled since the pandemic. He's been under tremendous stress. This is an investment to get him back on his feet." "And me?" The question came out sharper than I intended. "What about my share?" My mother smiled, that tender, patronizing smile I'd seen my whole life. "You're doing so well on your own. You've built a great career. You're strong and independent. You don't need the same kind of help Daniel does." For a second, I thought I might actually laugh. It was so absurd, so predictable, that I almost wanted to applaud them for their consistency. But the laughter never came. Instead, I felt my throat tighten, as if invisible hands were pressing against it. "So," I said slowly, "because I'm responsible, I get nothing?" "That's not what we're saying," my father replied, his voice calm, as if logic could smooth over the hurt. "We're proud of you, Claire. You've proven you can succeed without us. Daniel, on the other hand, needs encouragement. Support." Support. That word again. It tasted bitter in my mouth. I'd supported myself my entire life, but somehow that counted for nothing. I looked at Daniel, hoping for some flicker of discomfort, some acknowledgement of how wrong this was. But he just shifted in his chair, avoiding my gaze, his fingers tapping against his coffee cup. "This isn't what you think," he said quietly. "I didn't ask for this." "Didn't you?" I asked. He didn't answer. Mr. Carlyle continued outlining the logistics, the legal language, the financial transfers, the tax implications, but his words dissolved into white noise. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the scratch of my father's pen as he signed documents, the clink of my mother's bracelet when she reached for Daniel's hand. Every sound felt amplified, cruelly ordinary against the enormity of what was happening. I wasn't angry about the money itself, not exactly. What tore through me was the realization that this was the culmination of everything I'd felt growing up. I had been seen as self-sufficient to the point of being disposable. My strength had become their excuse for neglect, my independence, their justification for inequality. For years, I'd told myself that love didn't need to be measured in money or attention, that being overlooked was just part of being the dependable one. But sitting in that office, watching $15 million slide across the table toward my brother's name, I saw it clearly for the first time. This wasn't about love at all. It was about comfort, theirs, not mine. Giving Daniel more kept the balance they understood, the one where I didn't need, didn't ask, didn't receive. My mother placed a hand on my arm. "You're not upset, are you?" she asked, her voice sweetly concerned. "We just want both our children to be happy." I looked at her, searching for a trace of irony, but there was none. She believed it. She truly believed that what they were doing was fair. That hurt more than anything, knowing they were blind to their own cruelty. I stood then, because if I stayed seated, I might drown in the silence. "I'm happy for Daniel," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice. "I hope it helps." It was a lie, but a necessary one. I didn't trust myself to speak the truth without breaking something irreversible. Mr. Carlyle hesitated before speaking again. "There is one additional note from your parents," he said carefully. "They wanted to clarify that this arrangement doesn't preclude future adjustments. They simply feel that, at this stage, Daniel's needs are more immediate." Immediate. Another word to rationalize imbalance. I gathered my bag and walked to the window. Outside, rain had started to fall, streaking the glass in long, uneven lines. Denver looked gray and distant, almost foreign, as if I were seeing it from another lifetime. My reflection stared back at me, composed, professional, unflinching, the kind of woman my parents thought didn't need anything. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice again, soft and final. "You're strong, Claire. You'll be fine." Those words landed with the quiet violence of a door closing. I turned back to them, my heart pounding. "You've been saying that my whole life," I said, "and I believed you. But strength isn't the same as not needing love. It never was." Neither of them spoke. My father shifted uncomfortably. My mother blinked away what might have been guilt. Daniel looked like he wanted to disappear. The lawyer cleared his throat, sensing that the meeting had gone somewhere far beyond legal boundaries. "Perhaps we can conclude here," he said gently. As I gathered my coat, I noticed the smallest detail. A thick, sealed envelope sitting on the corner of Mr. Carlyle's desk, my grandmother's familiar handwriting across the front. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet. But as I stepped out into the rain, the cold drops soaking through my hair, a strange intuition pulsed in my chest. Something told me this story wasn't over. Something about that envelope, about the way the lawyer had looked at me just before I left, whispered that there were truths waiting to surface. Truths my parents hadn't counted on. And though I didn't know it at the time, that envelope would soon turn the pain of this betrayal into something far more powerful. A reckoning that would change everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and love. The following week, the rain returned to Denver, as if the sky itself couldn't let go of what had been said in that office. The memory of my parents' words had settled into me like a bruise, deep, dull, and throbbing in quiet moments. I had tried to push it away, to move on, to bury the humiliation under work and routine. But some wounds don't close just because you pretend they don't exist. They keep bleeding in the background until something or someone forces you to confront them. That someone was Mr. Carlyle, and that something was the envelope with my grandmother's name written in her elegant cursive. He called me 3 days after the will reading. His voice was calm but careful, the tone of a man who knows he's about to unearth something delicate. "Claire," he said, "I'd like you to come back to the office. There's a matter related to your grandmother, Margaret Ellis, that we need to discuss privately." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My grandmother had been gone for 2 years. The idea that there was still unfinished business, something she had planned beyond the grave, made my stomach tighten. I drove through the drizzle to his office, my mind running through possibilities. Maybe it was a personal note she'd left for me, maybe a keepsake. I wasn't prepared for what I was about to find. When I arrived, Mr. Carlyle was waiting by the window, a folder and a thick, sealed envelope on the desk in front of him. He gestured for me to sit. "I want to apologize," he began, "for not bringing this up during your parents' meeting. Your grandmother left explicit instructions about timing. She insisted that this envelope be opened only after your parents had finalized their own intentions for the inheritance." I felt my pulse quicken. "She knew this would happen?" I asked. "She anticipated it," he said simply. My eyes fell to the envelope, cream-colored paper, slightly yellowed around the edges. My name was written across the front in looping, confident handwriting. Claire, private and personal, to be opened in Mr. Carlyle's presence only. My throat felt dry as I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, several documents, and a set of old-fashioned brass keys. I recognized her perfume instantly, lavender and cedarwood. For a moment, I could almost see her, sitting in her armchair with her pearl earrings and that calm, knowing smile. The letter began, My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then I suspect life has once again shown you how unevenly love and fairness are distributed in our family. I felt my chest tighten as I read on. I have watched you grow into a woman of grace and determination, admired for your independence, yet punished for it. I know what it feels like to be praised for strength instead of being supported with love. I have lived that story myself. I paused, stunned. I had known my grandmother as warm, composed, endlessly patient, but I had never thought of her as someone who had suffered like I had. She had always seemed above the mess of our family, but her words suggested otherwise. I want you to know, the letter continued, that I saw everything: the quiet favoritism, the subtle dismissals, the ways in which your parents mistook your competence for invulnerability. I also saw the loneliness in your eyes at every family gathering. I cannot change their choices, but I can give you what they failed to: security, respect, and the freedom to choose your own path. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the next page. 25 years ago, I established a private trust in your name, she wrote. It began with the sale of my first business and has since grown through careful investment. I wanted to ensure that when the time came, you would have the means to live without depending on anyone's approval. Mr. Carlyle began to explain as I kept reading. Your grandmother was quite deliberate, he said. She managed these assets separately from the family estate. None of your parents' advisors were aware of it. The documents in the folder listed the assets in astonishing detail. A Victorian apartment building in San Francisco, fully owned and generating rental income. A commercial office space in Seattle, leased to a tech firm with a decade-long contract. A lakefront cottage in Lake Tahoe, the same one she used to visit with me during summer breaks, though I'd thought she'd sold it years ago. And finally, a portfolio of long-term investments, blue-chip stocks, index funds, and something called the Ellis Foundation account. Together, they were worth over $10 million. But even as the numbers sank in, I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about what it meant, that my grandmother had quietly spent decades building a safety net for me, one she knew I would need even before I did. The letter continued. These assets are yours alone, Claire. Not to prove your worth, but to remind you that it was never in question. Use them as you see fit, to build, to rest, to heal. You have been the strong one long enough. Now I want you to have ease. Tears blurred the ink on the page. For the first time in years, I felt something close to being seen. Mr. Carlyle slid another document toward me. Your grandmother also left a statement of record, he said. She detailed the financial support your parents provided to Daniel over the years. She wanted transparency, not revenge. I scanned the neatly typed list, hundreds of transactions over 2 decades, business loans, gifts, even tuition payments for classes Daniel never finished. Each entry carried a date and an amount. It was a ledger of inequality, and seeing it in black and white was both devastating and vindicating. She was meticulous, Mr. Carlyle said quietly. She also requested that you be made aware that your parents received substantial assistance from her as well, over $2 million, under the condition that it would benefit both grandchildren equally. She suspected, however, that this was not the case. I couldn't breathe for a moment. My grandmother hadn't just guessed the truth. She had documented it. She had known exactly what was happening. There was one final page. Her handwriting had grown slightly uneven, but her message was clear. Claire, love should never be conditional upon need. It should not require you to break before you are held. I have left you these resources not because you require them, but because you deserve them. One day, when you are ready, I hope you will use them to create the kind of fairness that was denied to you. I closed the letter and sat in silence. The office around me seemed to fade. All I could think about was her voice, the warmth of it, the quiet conviction. I had spent years trying to earn the love I already deserved, and somehow, even from beyond the grave, my grandmother had found a way to give it to me. When I finally looked up, Mr. Carlyle's expression was gentle. She was proud of you, he said simply. You were the one she trusted to carry her values forward. I nodded, though words felt inadequate. The keys in my hand felt heavy, symbolic. A tangible reminder that I had been chosen not out of pity, but out of recognition. My grandmother hadn't just left me money. She had left me proof that strength and worth were not opposites. As I walked out of the office, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining like glass. For the first time in weeks, I felt the air loosen around me. My grandmother had built a legacy not just of wealth, but of justice. Quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal. I thought about my parents, sitting somewhere in their perfect suburban home, still believing they controlled the story. They didn't know that Margaret Ellis had rewritten it long before they even realized there was another ending. And as I stood there under the fading gray sky, I realized that my grandmother hadn't merely handed me an inheritance. She had handed me a choice to continue living as the forgotten strong one, or to step fully into the power she had always seen in me. The following Friday, Mr. Carlyle called again. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of unease I couldn't quite place. "Claire," he said, "I believe you should be present when we go over the remaining contents of your grandmother's trust. Your parents have requested clarification on several points." For a moment, I considered refusing. The thought of sitting across from my parents so soon after learning what they'd done filled me with a kind of exhaustion that settled in my bones. But something inside me, maybe the same instinct that had pushed my grandmother to prepare for this exact moment, told me to go. The truth, after all, rarely stays buried. When I walked into Mr. Carlyle's office, the air felt different from before. There was tension beneath the surface, the kind that comes when people realize the story they've told themselves is about to collapse. My mother looked pale but composed, her lipstick a shade too bright against her tight smile. My father avoided my eyes, pretending to study the documents in front of him. Daniel sat slouched in his chair, his usual confidence replaced by something brittle. Mr. Carlyle began calmly. "I've reviewed the contents of Mrs. Ellis's trust in full. She was very explicit in her documentation and left behind substantial records regarding financial distributions within your family." He paused before continuing. "It appears Mrs. Ellis kept careful notes on every monetary transfer between herself and her children, as well as those made by Mr. and Mrs. Donovan to Daniel." I watched my father stiffen. "Those were private family matters," he said sharply. "With respect, Mr. Donovan," Carlyle replied, "your mother was within her rights to monitor how her contributions were used, particularly when she intended them to benefit both grandchildren equally." He spread a series of documents across the table. Columns of numbers, signatures, dates, the paper trail of favoritism laid bare. My eyes skimmed the pages: tuition payments, business loans, emergency gifts. Over the past decade alone, Daniel had received more than $500,000 directly from our parents. And when Carlyle revealed that my grandmother had given them nearly $2 million over 15 years, funds meant to secure both her grandchildren's futures, the silence in the room grew suffocating. My mother's voice broke the stillness. That money went toward family expenses, household needs. Did those needs include 3 separate investments into Daniel's restaurants? Carlyle asked evenly. Because Mrs. Ellis noted each one here. My father shifted, his jaw tight. "We helped our son because he needed it." The words landed heavy between us. That word again, needed. It was the family gospel, the justification for every imbalance. I stared at my parents, wondering if they even heard themselves anymore. Carlyle continued. "Mrs. Ellis also commissioned a private investigator 6 months before her passing. She wanted confirmation of her suspicions." He opened another folder and laid out photographs, financial reports, and receipts. The investigation revealed that Daniel's restaurant has been profitable for the past 18 months. In fact, his last financial statement showed a surplus. The room fell completely still. My father blinked as though struggling to process the words. "That can't be right," he murmured. "Daniel told us." "That business was struggling," my mother finished for him, her voice fragile. I turned toward my brother. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. "Is it true?" I asked quietly. Daniel swallowed hard, then nodded. "It's complicated." "Try me," I said. He exhaled, looking down. "I didn't lie. Not exactly. I just told them the worst parts of it. Cash flow was tight for a while, and I thought if they helped me again, I could expand. It wasn't about greed. It was survival." My mother reached for his arm. "You should have told us the truth," she whispered, though her voice trembled more with embarrassment than anger. My father looked older in that moment than I'd ever seen him. Do you have any idea what this makes us look like? I almost laughed at the irony of it. Their concern wasn't about fairness, but appearance. The same fixation that had shaped our family from the beginning. I looked at Daniel. You didn't just take their money. You took their belief in your weakness and turned it into your weapon. You knew they couldn't resist saving you. His eyes met mine for the first time, full of something like shame. You don't understand what it's like, he said softly. They expect me to need them. If I didn't, I wouldn't know who I was to them anymore. It was the closest he'd ever come to admitting the truth, and strangely, I almost pitied him. He was trapped in the very dependency that had once protected him. Carlyle cleared his throat gently. There's more. He handed me another envelope, smaller than the last, sealed with the same wax crest I'd seen before. This one is addressed to you directly, but Mrs. Ellis asked that it be read aloud, with your family present. My hands shook slightly as I broke the seal. My grandmother's handwriting flowed across the page, firm and graceful even in its finality. My dear Claire, it began, if this letter is being read aloud, then the truth I feared has revealed itself. Your parents have once again placed the burden of strength upon you and the burden of need upon your brother. It is a dynamic I have watched for decades. Know that their choices reflect their own fears, not your worth. Your father confuses control with love, and your mother mistakes protection for affection. Daniel has simply learned to survive within their story. But you, my darling, must write your own. The words hit something deep inside me, an ache I hadn't allowed myself to feel since she died. She had known, every nuance, every wound I had buried. The letter continued, I have given you not just the means to stand apart from their patterns, but the evidence of them, so that you will never again doubt what you experienced. Use this truth wisely, not for vengeance, but for peace. And remember, compassion and boundaries can exist together. You owe them honesty, but not permission. When I finished reading, the room was silent. My mother had tears in her eyes, though I wasn't sure if they were for me or for herself. My father stared at the desk, jaw clenched. Daniel looked small, younger than I'd ever seen him. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She saw everything, I said softly, even the things we didn't say out loud. My father's voice broke the silence. What do you want from us, Claire? It was a strange question, part weary, part defensive. For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. What did I want? An apology? Justice? Time couldn't be rewound. The money couldn't erase the imbalance. What I wanted was something simpler, acknowledgement. I want the truth, I said finally. No excuses. No more pretending this family has been fair. My mother covered her mouth, trying to keep her voice steady. We never meant to hurt you. I know, I said, and I did. Intentions had never been the problem. It was blindness, the kind born from years of habit and fear. But meaning well doesn't make it right. Daniel stood then, his voice rough. I'm sorry, Claire. I should have said something years ago. I nodded slowly. You could have. But I guess we were all playing our roles. You were the one who needed saving. I was the one who didn't, and they liked it that way. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mr. Carlyle quietly began gathering the documents. Mrs. Ellis requested that all parties receive copies of these records, he said. She believed transparency was the only path to healing. Healing. The word felt foreign in that room, but as I stood to leave, I realized it was the only thing left to reach for. Outside, the rain had started again, soft and steady. I stepped out into it without an umbrella, letting the cold drops sting my skin. It felt cleansing somehow, as though the truth had finally cracked open the air. My grandmother's letter pressed against my chest beneath my coat, warm despite the chill. For the first time in my life, the silence around our family didn't feel suffocating. It felt like space to breathe, space to begin again. In the weeks that followed that second meeting with Mr. Carlyle, life seemed to unfold in two different rhythms. One outside of me, steady and predictable, and one inside, pulsing with quiet chaos. Each morning I woke in my Denver apartment, made coffee, and went to work as if nothing had changed. But beneath the routine was a new awareness that nothing about my life was the same. The truth had rewritten everything. The imbalance I'd once endured without question had been dragged into the light, exposed, and cataloged in my grandmother's neat handwriting. It should have made me angry, But it didn't. Not in the way I expected. Anger felt too small, too ordinary for what I was feeling. What filled me instead was resolve. For the first time, I stopped trying to make sense of my parents' choices. I had spent years twisting myself into someone easy to love, easy to dismiss, someone who never needed too much or asked too loudly. My grandmother's letter changed that. It gave me permission to stop shrinking just to keep the peace. It wasn't about revenge or confrontation anymore. It was about reclaiming space that had always been mine. One Saturday morning, I drove west toward Lake Tahoe, the place my grandmother had written about in her will. The air grew thinner as the road climbed, the pine trees thickening on either side. The lake appeared suddenly, a stretch of impossible blue framed by mountains dusted with snow. I pulled up to the small cottage she had left me, its white paint weathered but intact, its windows reflecting the light like eyes that had been waiting for me. When I stepped inside, the smell of cedar and lavender met me like a memory. The furniture was simple, the kind of comfort that doesn't beg for attention. A stack of her old gardening books sat on the coffee table, their pages still marked with her notes in pencil. In one of the drawers, I found a photo of us, me at 12, her at 70, both of us laughing, our hands covered in flour from the pie we'd tried and failed to bake. I sank into the worn armchair by the window and cried for the first time since all of it had happened. Not out of grief, but out of release. That weekend at the lake was when I decided to leave my job at the communications firm. It wasn't a reckless choice. It was the first deliberate one I'd made in years. The idea had been stirring in me since I'd learned about the properties my grandmother left. The building in San Francisco, the commercial space in Seattle, they weren't just investments. They were beginnings. I would manage them myself, learn the business, and build something that was truly mine. When I told my boss, he looked surprised but supportive. "You've always had an independent streak," he said. I smiled, because for once, that word didn't sting. Independence no longer meant isolation. It meant possibility. Over the next few months, I spent my time traveling between the cities that now carried pieces of my grandmother's legacy. The Victorian apartment building in San Francisco had high ceilings, cracked molding, and tenants who told me they'd never met the owner before. I hired a local restoration team, determined to preserve the charm while improving what needed care. In Seattle, the commercial space thrummed with life. A young tech company occupying the top floors, their enthusiasm infectious. Each visit felt like uncovering a small piece of my grandmother's soul, evidence of her quiet genius for building not just wealth, but continuity. But perhaps the most transformative part of that season wasn't what I gained, it was what I let go of. I stopped checking my phone for messages from my parents. For years, I'd lived in a cycle of craving their approval and resenting it when it didn't come. Now, silence was no longer painful. It was peaceful. When my mother finally did call, her voice hesitant and trembling, I didn't ignore it. I listened. She spoke of therapy, of regret, of trying to understand how things had gone so wrong. I believed her sincerity, but I didn't rush to fix it. Healing, I realized, wasn't my responsibility alone. My brother Daniel reached out a few weeks later. His tone was stripped of bravado. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just wanted you to know I'm trying to make things right." He told me he had sold the restaurant and was paying back some of the money our parents had funneled to him. He was working as a consultant now, living more quietly. I didn't know if I trusted his transformation, but I wished him well. There was a time when I would have carried his shame for him. Now I let it stay where it belonged. That same summer, I launched a mentorship program for women in midlife who were rebuilding after loss, divorce, or career burnout. I called it the Ellis Initiative, after my grandmother. It began modestly. 5 women meeting twice a month at the cottage by the lake, sharing coffee and stories. Many of them carried wounds that mirrored my own, years spent giving too much, asking for too little. Together, we learned that strength wasn't about stoicism. It was about allowing yourself to be fully seen without apology. One evening, as the sun set behind the lake, painting the water gold, I realized that bitterness had no place left to live inside me. It wasn't that I'd forgotten the betrayal. I had simply outgrown it. The truth had done its work. It had burned everything false to ash, leaving only what was real. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory, soft but firm. You owe them honesty, but not permission. In September, I returned to Denver for the first time in months. My parents invited me to dinner, a small, awkward attempt at normalcy. Their house looked the same, the white shutters, the trimmed hedges, but everything inside felt different. The air was quieter, humbler. My father greeted me with a hug that was hesitant but genuine. My mother served roast chicken, her hands shaking slightly as she poured the wine. There were apologies between the lines of every word they said, but I didn't press for more. I didn't need them to rewrite the past. I just needed them to stop pretending it hadn't happened. At the end of the evening, my father asked, "Do you think things can ever be the same again?" I met his eyes and answered gently, "I don't think they should be." He nodded, and for once, I saw understanding instead of defensiveness in his face. When I drove back to the lake that night, the sky was clear, stars spilling across the horizon. I rolled down the window, letting the wind rush through the car, and felt something shift inside me. Freedom, I realized, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, the calm that comes after you stop explaining your worth to people who can't see it. The next morning, I sat on the porch of the cottage with a cup of coffee and reread my grandmother's final letter. The paper had grown soft from how often I'd unfolded it, but the ink remained dark and certain. Use these resources to build the life you deserve, she'd written. And remember, the world needs women who are both kind and unyielding. I smiled, tracing the curve of her signature. For years, I had believed that being strong meant standing alone. Now I understood what she had always tried to teach me. Strength, when chosen over bitterness, becomes something far greater. It becomes legacy. Time has an odd way of folding in on itself after truth finally arrives. The months that followed that summer at Lake Tahoe felt at once suspended and racing forward. The shock of everything that had happened, the discovery of my grandmother's trust, the unraveling of my parents' favoritism, Daniel's deceit, had slowly settled into something quieter but heavier: consequence. It was as though the roles each of us had played for decades were dissolving, and none of us quite knew who we were without them. For my parents, the reckoning came slowly. The house that had once been filled with a sense of control now seemed haunted by its own silence. I visited only occasionally, but when I did, I could feel it: the fragile politeness, the cautious way they spoke to each other. My father, once proud and immovable, now carried an uncertainty in his voice, as if he were learning to speak a new language. My mother had started therapy, and though she didn't say much about it, I saw the difference in her eyes. They were softer, no longer scanning the room for something to fix. She had begun volunteering at a women's shelter in Denver, helping single mothers build resumes and prepare for job interviews. It was her way of atoning, I think. A small step toward understanding the kind of strength she had mistaken for invulnerability in me. Daniel's fall was less graceful. After selling his restaurant, he tried to start again, investing in a catering venture that crumbled within months. Without my parents to bail him out, something they'd sworn to stop doing after my grandmother's revelations, he spiraled. I heard from mutual friends that he'd moved into a modest apartment in Boulder and taken a job as a line cook at one of the city's high-end restaurants. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel was living within limits. When he called me one evening, his voice was stripped of arrogance. "I'm learning what it feels like to earn something," he said. "It's harder than I thought, but it feels cleaner, if that makes sense." "It does," I said quietly. "It's what you were supposed to learn years ago." There was a long pause. "I don't blame you for hating me, Claire." "I don't hate you," I told him. "I just stopped carrying the parts of you that were never mine to carry." He didn't respond for a while, and when he finally spoke again, his voice broke a little. "I'm sorry for all of it, for letting them treat you that way, for letting myself believe it was okay." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was honesty. And for our family, honesty was a new language too. As for me, my life had begun to settle into something that felt both foreign and deeply right. The Ellis Initiative grew from 5 women at a lakeside table to a community of dozens, each with her own story of resilience. Some were rebuilding after divorce, others after decades of being overlooked in their families or careers. Every time I listened to one of them speak, I heard echoes of my own past. We weren't there to fix each other. We were there to be seen. I began partnering with local nonprofits in San Francisco and Seattle, creating microgrants to help women start small businesses. The first time I handed a check to a woman who wanted to open a bakery in her neighborhood, she cried. I did too. There was something deeply healing about transforming what had once been my family's currency of control into a tool for freedom. The money no longer symbolized favoritism or resentment. It symbolized choice. Every dollar spent with intention became an act of rewriting the story my parents had unknowingly taught me, that love is measured by dependence. Still, healing wasn't linear. There were nights I sat alone in the cottage at Tahoe and felt the old ache creep in, the ache of wishing my grandmother were still alive to see all of this. I wanted to tell her that her plan had worked, that her faith in me had been justified. I wanted her to know that I finally understood what she'd meant when she wrote, "Compassion and boundaries can exist together." Sometimes, I'd find myself back in Denver for business or family therapy sessions my parents had invited me to attend. They were awkward at first, the air thick with the residue of things unsaid. But over time, something began to shift. The sessions became less about blame and more about curiosity. My father once admitted, his voice trembling, "I didn't know how to love a daughter who didn't need saving. I thought I was honoring your independence, not abandoning you to it." It wasn't an excuse, but it was the closest he had ever come to self-awareness, and it was enough. My mother, too, had begun to change. One evening, she handed me a letter she'd written but never sent. In it, she confessed how frightened she'd been of losing control of her children's futures. "You were so self-sufficient, Claire," she wrote. "I convinced myself you didn't need softness. I thought I was raising a woman who could survive anything. I never realized I was teaching you to expect so little in return." Reading her words didn't erase the past, but it softened its edges. It allowed me to see her not as a villain, but as a flawed woman shaped by her own generation's fears. The day I finally invited them to visit the lake cottage was the first time our family felt whole, not repaired, but honest. My parents walked through the door hesitantly, looking around as if entering sacred ground. My mother touched the photo of Grandma Margaret that hung above the mantel, tears pooling in her eyes. My father stepped out onto the porch and stared across the water for a long time before speaking. "She was right about you," he said quietly. "You've built something lasting." I smiled. "She built it first. I'm just continuing the work." That evening, as the three of us sat watching the sun sink behind the mountains, I realized how much peace there was in acceptance. We would never return to what we were before, but maybe that was the point. Families, like people, are meant to evolve. Daniel joined us a few months later, bringing with him a humility I hadn't thought him capable of. He cooked dinner, simple food, nothing showy, and afterward, he told me he'd started paying down his debts. "It feels good to take responsibility," he said. "I wish it hadn't taken losing everything to learn that." I nodded, knowing there were no shortcuts to growth. Sometimes you have to let the foundation crack so you can rebuild it properly. As the months turned into a year, the bitterness that had once filled my veins began to dissolve into something gentler. Not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. The past remained what it was. Unequal, painful, irrevocable, but I no longer carried it like armor. I had learned to set it down and walk forward lighter. One evening, while reviewing the quarterly reports for the properties my grandmother had left me, I caught myself smiling, not because of the numbers, but because of the stability they represented. For so long, I had equated stability with dependence, thinking it was something that could be given or taken away. Now I knew better. True stability comes from clarity, from knowing who you are even when the people who raised you never quite did. Sometimes I still visit my parents' home in Denver, and when I do, the air feels different. My father greets me with a hug that doesn't come from guilt, but from recognition. My mother listens more than she speaks. Daniel drops by occasionally, still learning to stand on his own, but trying. We are not a perfect family, perhaps we never were, but we are, finally, a real one. Looking back, I see how every painful revelation, every confrontation, every tear in that lawyer's office was necessary. Without them, none of us would have been forced to see ourselves clearly. And maybe that's what my grandmother intended all along, not to punish, but to liberate. She knew the truth would hurt, but she also knew it would set us free. It took losing the illusion of fairness to find the reality of peace. And in that peace, I discovered something I'd spent a lifetime searching for. Not justice, not vindication, but balance. A year after the day I walked out of that lawyer's office, life had taken on a quiet rhythm I hadn't known I craved. There was no dramatic transformation, no single defining victory, just the steady hum of peace, the kind that comes from knowing the chaos behind you no longer dictates the path ahead. I still lived between the cities my grandmother's legacy had tied me to, Denver, San Francisco, Seattle, but the lake cottage at Tahoe had become my true home. It was there, surrounded by pine and water and silence, that I finally began to understand what all of this had been about. It had never really been about money. It was about love, the way we give it, the way we withhold it, the way it shapes us when we spend a lifetime mistaking approval for affection. When I was younger, I used to think strength was a posture. I believed it meant keeping a straight spine and a steady voice, even when my heart wanted to crumble. I wore composure like armor because I thought that's what strong people did. They endured quietly. My parents mistook that quiet for resilience, and I let them. It was easier than asking for what I needed and being denied. But in the stillness of that first winter at Tahoe, I began to see that strength had nothing to do with silence. Real strength was about staying open, to pain, to disappointment, to possibility. It was about not letting bitterness harden you into someone unrecognizable. One morning, I found myself rereading my grandmother's letter by the window, the paper soft at the edges from how often I'd unfolded it. I traced her handwriting with my thumb, those graceful, deliberate curves that seemed to pulse with the steadiness she'd carried through her own storms. Her words had become my compass. Compassion and boundaries can exist together. For so long, I'd lived on one side of that truth or the other, either compassionate to the point of erasure or so boundaried that no one could reach me. Finding balance between the two had been her final gift, and learning it was the work of my life. The work was slow. It came in moments rather than milestones. It was in forgiving my mother, not for her blindness, but for being shaped by a generation that taught women to measure their worth in sacrifice. It was in watching my father learn to listen, really listen, without trying to solve or justify. It was in seeing Daniel, my brother, once the golden son, show up to one of my mentorship meetings with a tray of pastries he'd baked himself. He stood in the doorway awkwardly, unsure if he belonged there. When one of the women asked who he was, I said, "My brother." He's learning what rebuilding looks like, too. The room erupted in warmth, and for the first time, Daniel looked proud of something that wasn't money or ambition. Love had changed shape for all of us. My parents' apologies didn't erase the years of imbalance, but they became acts of humility rather than defense. They no longer spoke of fairness in the language of numbers or inheritance, but in small gestures. My father offering to fix something at the cottage, my mother sending handwritten notes instead of guarded texts. We were all learning to love without control. As for me, I stopped chasing the illusion of balance between us and started nurturing balance within myself. The Ellis Initiative grew into something I could never have imagined, a network of women across 3 states, many of them older than me, some younger, all connected by the shared experience of being told they were too strong for help. We built workshops around financial literacy, entrepreneurship, and emotional healing. But what surprised me most wasn't how many women showed up. It was how quickly they started showing up for each other. One evening, after a particularly emotional meeting, a woman hugged me and said, "You made me realize strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about knowing I can rebuild." Her words felt like a mirror of my grandmother's wisdom passed forward through time. The more I taught others about self-worth, the more I realized I was still learning it myself. Some days, the old wounds whispered again, that small, persistent voice asking if I was still the daughter who needed to prove her value. But those moments came and went like waves, brief reminders of an ocean I'd already learned to swim across. I had built a life where my worth was no longer up for debate, and that realization was both humbling and liberating. One evening, standing on the dock as the sun dipped low over Tahoe, I caught my reflection in the water. Older, steadier, softer. The surface rippled, blurring the image, and I thought of my grandmother again, of how she must have known that healing wouldn't come from confrontation or punishment, but from choice. She hadn't just given me wealth, she'd given me the agency to define what that wealth meant. For her, money had always been a tool, one she used not to control but to protect. I finally understood that she'd left her assets not out of resentment toward my parents, but as a correction to the imbalance she couldn't bear to leave unresolved. Later that year, I hosted a small gathering at the cottage, a mixture of family and women from the initiative. The fire crackled in the hearth, laughter filled the air, and for the first time I felt no division between the parts of my life. My mother helped in the kitchen, my father poured wine, Daniel played guitar by the fireplace. At one point, my mother turned to me and said, "Your grandmother would be so proud of what you've built." I smiled, feeling something in my chest loosen. "She'd be proud of all of us," I said, and I meant it. Because in her way, she had set each of us free. My parents had been freed from their delusion of control, Daniel from his dependence, and me from the belief that love must be earned through pain. When everyone had gone to bed that night, I stepped outside. The lake shimmered beneath a canopy of stars, calm and infinite. I thought about how strange it was that such stillness could grow out of years of noise. My grandmother's voice seemed to drift through the pines. "You've been the strong one long enough? Now I want you to have ease." For the first time, I let myself believe I had finally found it. In the end, the story of my family wasn't one of villains and victims. It was a story about blindness and awakening, about the quiet revolution that happens when truth replaces denial. We were imperfect people learning, late but earnestly, what love without hierarchy could look like. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Learn to love better, to see clearer, to choose strength not as armor but as grace. Looking back, I no longer feel bitterness when I think of that day in the lawyer's office. Instead, I see it as the necessary fracture that allowed the light in. It was the moment that stripped away the illusions and forced us to confront who we really were. My grandmother had orchestrated it not out of anger, but out of faith. Faith that I would transform pain into purpose. And she was right. Today, when people ask me what I learned from all of it, I tell them this: love and strength are not opposites. They are the same thing, expressed differently. Strength without love becomes cruelty. Love without strength becomes dependency. The goal is not to choose one, but to live in the space where they coexist. That is where healing begins. As the morning light rises over the lake now, I find peace in knowing that I've broken the pattern. My grandmother's legacy wasn't just the properties or the investments. It was the reminder that true inheritance is not what you receive, but what you carry forward. And I carry forward this: that being strong should never mean being alone, and that love, when given freely and without fear, is the most enduring wealth of all. In the end, Claire Donovan's story was never just about inheritance. It was about awakening. What began as a brutal act of favoritism at a will reading evolved into a profound journey of truth, forgiveness, and self-definition. Through her grandmother, Margaret Ellis's foresight, Claire discovered that strength should never be mistaken for self-sufficiency, nor love for control. The hidden trust was more than wealth. It was a mirror reflecting decades of imbalance and a blueprint for rebuilding not just finances, but dignity. Her parents, once blind to their biases, learned humility through loss. Her brother Daniel, stripped of privilege, learned accountability through struggle. And Claire herself transformed pain into purpose, turning her grandmother's legacy into the Ellis Initiative, a living testament to the idea that independence and compassion can coexist. The lesson her story leaves us is deeply human. Being strong does not mean carrying everything alone. Many of us are taught to endure quietly, to earn affection through success or sacrifice. But true strength lies in allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, to ask for fairness without guilt, to set boundaries without shame. In our world today, where independence is praised but emotional needs are often dismissed, Claire's story reminds us that love and respect must walk hand in hand. Her journey invites us to examine our own families, our own definitions of strength, and ask, where have we mistaken endurance for peace? Now, let me ask you something. If you were in Claire's position, what would you do? A. Confront your family and demand justice immediately. B. Step back, let time reveal the truth, and choose peace over revenge. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell us why. And finally, what about you? How do you see strength and love in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can reflect too. Don't forget to subscribe and support this channel so we can keep bringing you powerful stories like this one.